Camimo.
So, good evening and welcome to this session that explores ideas for how we can move beyond fragmentation to construct Atlantic communities of interest. It's a pleasure to be your moderator again. And as always, at Atlantic Dialogues, we have a lineup of incredibly brilliant people offering their insights as our panelists. Here they are. I'll call out Sergio Alcocer, who's the president of the Mexican Council on Foreign Relations. He's also a research professor at the National Autonomous University of Mexico. Next we have, please have a seat, yes, go ahead. And next we have Stephanie Miley, Senior Advisor for Atlantic Cooperation. Ms. Miley is also the U.S. Ambassador nominee to the Gambia and is awaiting Senate confirmation. Thank you for joining us. And last but not least, we have Dr. Mampele Rampele, who's a member of the Planetary Guardians. Dr. Rampele was a co-founder of the Black Consciousness Movement with Steve Biko that reignited the struggle for freedom in South Africa. Thank you. So we have a framing video for this conversation. Before we get started, let's watch it on our screens.
The wider Atlantic offers a unique framework for cooperation among Africa, Latin America, the Caribbean, North America, and Europe, emphasizing shared histories, interlinked economies, and common challenges. This concept promotes collaboration to tackle climate change, economic diversification, and demographic shifts. By fostering dialogue and action beyond traditional geopolitical silos, the wider Atlantic prioritizes inclusive growth, sustainable development, and innovation. It seeks to deepen trade ties, advance technology, and develop governance models reflecting shared priorities. Redefining multilateral relations will create inclusive, equitable futures for all regions. What mechanisms enhance trade and innovation? How can cooperation drive sustainable economic strategies? How can trans-regional synergies support sustainable economies and build resilience against global challenges?
In which this picks up from where the conversation yesterday about the Atlantic at the crossroads left off. And so I'd like to crowdsource the wisdom in the room with a diagnostic. Please go to your gadgets, to your AD Connect, to answer this question. What one word describes the biggest challenge to creating cohesive Atlantic communities of interest? What one word describes the biggest challenge to creating cohesive Atlantic communities? Is it not showing on your? It is, okay. Okay, yeah. And so let's see what comes up. Polarization.
Food.
Capacity disparities. Distance. Okay, so distance is coming up, and I think we've, successive panels and polarization, interest and trust. Panelists, I'll come to you, and my first question to you is, how would you respond to what we're seeing on our screens? Which of these issues do you think should be the top priority for wider Atlantic cooperation? And I'll start with you, Ms. Miley.
Thank you so much. I'm delighted to be back here. I had spent 3 wonderful years in Morocco and know well Morocco's interest in the Atlantic and its amazing work to try and bring people together in conversation to include the Atlantic dialogues. I think that for me, I'll just say I've just recently started as the senior advisor for a new initiative in the U.S. government called the Partnership for Atlantic Cooperation. And I see all of these things being an issue. I was mentioning to our wonderful moderator before that sometimes our institutions create fragmentation because of the way that we consider how we divide ourselves. I can speak mostly to government, but we do that in academia, we do it in NGOs. It's a center for North Atlantic. It's even in the State Department where I am, we have the Middle East, North Africa. Morocco is in that grouping, not in Sub-Saharan Africa. Well, of course, Morocco thinks of itself as an African nation that has a foot everywhere. But our own institutions sometimes exacerbate what may be viewed as fragmentation or polarization because we don't work across those bureaucratic lines. So I think that's one of the things we're trying to do with this new initiative, is to work across bureaucratic lines and bring together a new grouping from our side, from the way the U.S. has viewed it. I know other countries may have already engaged in this way, but the entire Atlantic, not the North Atlantic, not the South, but all of the Atlantic countries, to talk about critical issues like aquaculture, blue economy, environmental damage, and things like that.
And yet, one of the words we see there, actually, two of the words, I'll pick up on the negative words, interference, polarization, interests. Given where you sit, and I know you have to be careful, and we were reminded earlier that things change on November 4th, but given where you sit, with the U.S. typically accused of interference and subverting things that don't align with its interests, what role can trying to choose my words carefully on your behalf, what role can you play in this sort of complex geopolitical situation we find ourselves in at the moment to ensure that we have functional communities of interest?
Exactly. No, thank you. That's a very good question, a very valid question. I think that what all of us need to do, and I'm not talking, of course, I'm government, but academia, NGOs, private sector, we all need to look for ways in which we can collaborate and listen to each other of what our issues are that are most important and how we can address those with resources, with expertise, with shared knowledge. And that's what we're trying to do with this new initiative. It is focused on some very specific, and I apologize to people sitting behind me. I will turn, because I hate to have my back to you, but it's some very specific things, like, for instance, in Angola, helping Angola to refurbish a scientific research vessel and bring new scientists, young scientists, to learn about the area so that way they can help in the aquaculture issues that are so important. So I think it's taking a more humble approach, an approach that's more cooperative, that's more learning from each other, and opening up the doors of all these institutions to hearing from others, so that it's not just one group and not another.
Okay, thank you. I'll come to Mexico. We'll stay with the Americas, because if the U.S. Needs to be a bit more humble and collaborative, Mexico and your president are certainly showing us what it sounds like and feels like to have a robust foreign policy. From where you sit, how can institutions like the Mexican Council on Foreign Relations help foster dialogue, the listening that Stephanie has just asked us to adopt to align Northern and Southern Atlantic priorities?
Well, Ludwig, thank you very much, first of all, and I would like to thank the Policy Center for the New South for the invitation, and I want to acknowledge the presence of the Mexican ambassador to Morocco. And I think the question, of course, is very valid, and I would like to say that the Mexican Council on Foreign Relations is a think tank similar to PCNW. It is a new PCNS. It is a think tank that is organized to actually bring together experts from different fields. And as a think tank is to bring knowledge, but also the expertise that particularly practitioners, whether from the private sector, public sector, or NGOs, can bring to discuss things. But I would like to make an emphasis that you mentioned that this panel sort of follows what was discussed yesterday. And I don't want to discuss identity anymore. And I don't want to discuss whether the South exists or not. I think we need to be more pragmatical into the approach. So I think that the think tanks, what we can do is to put the ideas together that are pragmatical. And Stephanie was mentioning about scientific cooperation. And I think this is one of the words that we need to substitute in the words that appeared here. There were negative words. All of them were negative words. Whereas we should use a positive word. Why don't we use cooperation as a word? And then we can start talking about scientific cooperation, like the vessel that Stephanie mentioned in Angola, or we can talk about technological cooperation. Several times the word innovation was mentioned yesterday. And but in order to have innovation, you need to have people that are trained to actually innovate. And innovation is not something that you can take a course, innovation 1, 2, or 3, and then you become an innovator. That doesn't work like that. You need to have a culture of innovation, and of course that can be built, but you need to change. And culture change, as we all know, is quite difficult. It takes time, but you need to do it. So I think this is one of the things that from Mexico and from Latin America, and Mexico is not only Latin American, it's a North American country, so we can play both sides. We can cooperate with Africa, and particularly with Morocco. We can learn a lot from Morocco, and I think Morocco and Africa can learn from us. Mm-hmm. And I think that having a vis-a-vis cooperation in these topics will be quite interesting, and this will be a way also to establish a more long-term cooperation and agreements with these areas.
Okay, I want to be fair to the audience. I asked them a negative question, which was the biggest challenge, which is why they responded with negative issues, and they will get an opportunity to respond to a positive question. Right. And so hopefully, that clears the air on that. But I'll stay with you, Sergio, because your expertise straddles engineering and public-private collaboration. And so given your extensive experience, what do you see that we can take in terms of building, in terms of constructing new communities of interest? You've talked about scientific cooperation, innovation, and culture, and these are things that are not necessarily new.
No.
What is new that you have to offer us from your experience?
Well, in terms of infrastructure, there is a big push throughout the world, and I think this is something that the African countries, Latin American countries have much to do, which has to do with sustainable infrastructure. About 18% of the gas emissions come from the cement and the steel industry. Half of them come from China because China is pretty much produces half of the cement and half of the steel. And about 38% or so of the emissions and the consumption in energy comes from buildings. And we are not doing enough in order to reduce the carbon embodied in infrastructure and the carbon that is produced through the operation of our buildings and infrastructure. So this is something that we can put our brains together in order to reduce the emissions, and this is something that will be contributing to fighting climate change, as has been discussed here, is the main threat that humankind throughout the world are facing, and this is something that we can work together. There is a claim that infrastructure like this will cost more because you are requiring to use certain materials that may not be available in your location. That might be true in certain places, but if you do a life cycle analysis of the overall infrastructure, that means from the planning all the way to the commission of that infrastructure, it makes sense economically to invest in that. And now we are more and more moving into recycling buildings. We don't accept anymore just demolishing a building and then building a new one. And we are trying to use as much as possible the buildings and infrastructure that we have. And so that means that, of course, we need to retrofit. We need to, in some cases, strengthen because of earthquakes, and Morocco suffered earthquakes here. And but in any case, we need to use as much as recycled materials that we can. And in order to do that, we need to develop those materials. We need to develop data about that materials. And we can use, of course, artificial intelligence, if you will, to doing that. But eventually, the very aim is to reduce gas emissions. And this is something that engineers and architects should be working on that. We should be preparing for that. This is something that is new, and they need to work on and together to accomplish this. And this particularly in terms of earthquakes, Morocco suffered an earthquake some months ago, about a year ago or so. Mexico has suffered many, many times of these, and of course we can work together in this area.
Thank you. So, Dr. Mampele, I come to you because we've started almost with a macro view of foreign affairs. We've, sort of come down into engineering and architecture. But there's a point you've been bringing up throughout the day, and it's about the language of, I hear inclusion, but also standards. And so from your perspective, with the work that you've been doing on shared humanity and inclusivity with the Planetary Guardians, what do you see emerging in terms of sustainable and equitable Atlantic governance models?
Thank you very much. I want to thank our hosts here. It's always wonderful to be here, but I'm particularly feeling at home in the circle. This is an acknowledgement of this cradle of humanity called Africa. And how we meet is this way, because then I can see you and you see me. We're talking about going beyond fragmentation to construct Atlantic communities. The starting point is on acknowledgement. How did we get here? And in a sense, we've got to use the polycrisis that is upon us. Let's not waste it. Use it to, first of all, acknowledge how did we get here? We got here because the divide and conquer of the colonial process literally undermined Africa as the cradle of humanity and the cradle of the first human civilization. So it's not as if we're going to rediscover engineering from Europe, or we had it here. I mean, how did you succeed in building the pyramids in Egypt if you didn't have architecture, engineering, and science? Okay? So if we acknowledge that, then we are able to tap into the rich heritage. That is a common human heritage. The second point I want to make is for us to construct these communities of interest, we've got to acknowledge another reality which our ancestors always understood. There's only one race. There are no races. One race, the human race. The reason there was this imposition of racist notions of superiority and inferiority is to justify land grabs, exploitation, enslavement of people. Because when you dehumanize them, you can live with treating them as less than. So what excites me about this conversation is that if we proceed from this place of acknowledgement, the re-embracing of the essence of being human. You know, human beings are amazing because we are born to be in relationships. You know, animals can give birth now and the little thing will trottle around under, behind its mother. Not human beings. So any notion that there is a selfish gene in human being, it's a construction. Human beings are not selfish. They are, in essence, generous because they have to live in community. Now imagine Africa and Latin America and all the Atlantic regions and nations coming together, leveraging this God-given capacity for being connected, interconnected, interdependent within the web of life, which means we don't put ourselves as human beings above nature. We are part of nature. And Mother Nature has been very generous to us because we have abused her, but she keeps giving us second chances. So I see this conversation as an opportunity for us as the people assembled here, but also where we come from, to have a fresh start. And this fresh start is not about how we combat the thing. It is how we leverage the rich endowments we have. I mean, Africa should not be worrying about fossil fuels. We've got plenty of sun, of wind, of the oceans around the continent. It should be natural that we are able to generate renewable, clean energy. Food security. Why is my country, with all of the science, the engineering, and the knowledge, still importing food? It's called mismanagement. It's called poor governance. It's called poor leadership. That is not a disease. It is an attitude. And so my point is that the obstacles in constructing these Atlantic communities of interest are very low bar obstacles. If we were to come together here and decide that we are going to take the long-term view, we are going to take the view of being responsible citizens of this wonderful geographic space called the Atlantic. And we will be able to set up models like Morocco is doing. It is setting up models of what is possible with good leadership.
Okay. So look, you've used a term which I am familiar with, the polycrisis. I'm not sure how many people are familiar with it in this room. Unpack that for us as you share with us how, for instance, the fresh start that you talk about, because communities of interest are not new concepts. We've heard about listening, we've heard about what is possible in terms of technical cooperation, but within the context of humanity and the polycrisis and fresh starts, what would a new, say, community of interest built around climate change look like?
I would take it beyond climate change because I think climate change is a symptom of a system of socio-economic and political relationships that's not fit for purpose. The system we have was designed to enrich a few at the expense of many, designed to exploit nature in the interest of profits. So when I talk about a fresh start, I'm talking about us needing to really step back and say, what kind of socioeconomic and political system would be appropriate to take advantage of the rich heritage of these Atlantic communities and build a different future? And Morocco is showing some elements of it. Some other countries may also be doing the same. I happen to come from a country which has snatched defeat out of the jaws of victory. South Africa has everything that it needs to be an absolutely successful country. But it hasn't succeeded because it hasn't acknowledged that it needed to learn from both the past and the future and need to understand that governance is not a populist endeavor. It's a professional, highly technical, and something that requires values-based leadership. But you look at post-colonial Africa, most of the leadership of the countries of the continent are people who've just stepped into the shoes of the departed colonials. Everything, including big Mercedes-Benz, blue light boys, the whole lot. The values of Ubuntu, the values of there is no me without the we have been lost. And so I go back to what someone said, that we should be teaching children science and geography. You can't. These are not machines. These are people. We've got, from the very beginning, in K to 12, be helping our young people to understand what it means to be human, what it means to be a citizen, and what are the rights and the responsibilities that come with it, and the values that should govern relationships. So I talked about polycrisis. We've got a crisis in terms of the planet that we live in. We have made it uninhabitable. We have a crisis of conflicts and wars. We have a crisis of the climate that is making life very precarious for the majority of people. All those crises are interlinked. And all of them require of us to go back to the beginning. You know, in African culture, if you get lost, don't keep going round and round. Go back to the beginning. And I'm glad you've all come to the mother continent where we began. So perhaps from here, we can go back with fresh ideas.
I think they're looking to you, the experts, panelists, for the fresh ideas. But I'll come to you in the audience with the positive question now. And so if you take out your gadgets, and the word cloud question I have for you is, what one word is the most significant opportunity for Atlantic collaboration? Opportunity, interference?
That's maybe a leftover from last time.
Is there something? What is the most significant opportunity for Atlantic collaboration? Young people.
Yes.
Well, that's good.
Youth. Okay, let's talk about young people, the youth. Emerging leaders are somewhere. They're scattered around the room. In Kenya, we've had the Gen Z protests, trying to correct decades of misrule and apathy, and poor choices by the older generations. What opportunities do you see existing for Atlantic collaboration that are intergenerational? Because I'm not sure that we know how to, until people go to the streets, we don't quite know how to talk to each other across generations.
I think that's a wonderful question for me because I have a 15-year-old. And with a 15-year-old at home, I'm living this day by day. But I would like to follow up on some comments that my panelists made, that I'm very pleased when you were talking about issues of starting again, being open and listening, and when Sergio was talking about, how we start things from the beginning. I think we need to move away from the zero-sum game mentality that we've had for decades, that I need to get economic development and I'm not. If I'm advancing in a way in competition with some other entity. I think we need more integration. And I think in the sense that when we look at issues, we're looking at them in a holistic fashion. We're looking for holistic responses and solutions. And we're looking at them in a way that will advance everyone, that will bring the most people forward. I think what I see with my 15-year-old, I don't know if it's for everybody, but the younger generation seem much more interested in collaborating with each other at all times. They want to be connected. I mean, if he goes a day without talking to his friends, it's a disaster, right? We have a problem. But in a way that's, even in school, they don't want to compete against each other. They don't want it to be that there's a first, someone who's smarter. They want to help each other. They want to be in these kinds of environments in school where they can be participating in team projects. And I think that's critical for us as we move forward, is to understand that the younger generations, I think, look at us sometimes, or certainly me and my generation, as being much too siloed in the way we view issues. Much too, we think of, as you were saying before, it's not that any one of these crises is something separate and not, having an impact on the other crises. They're all connected. But I think the younger generation sees that more holistically, and we need to start tapping into that now. Because I think they do come with a much more collaborative and cooperative approach to what they see as the world. So I hope that helps.
I'll come to the engineer to ask how. How do we tap into this energy, this generation that wants to collaborate, who we're bequeathing with a dying planet? How do we tap into the youthful exuberance that wants to survive despite the horrible cards we have dealt them?
Well, I wouldn't be so doomed. I think we have problems, of course, but I mean, we need to solve them, and that's why engineers are for.
Yeah,
right?
there you go.
Anyway, so I would say that there are two things. First of all, one thing is collaborate, one other thing is cooperate. And I think for me, cooperate is that we're going to be four of us, and then we're going to share the burden, four of us. That's cooperation. Collaboration is that you're working yourselves, and then just come as an outsider to do a little bit. And that's collaboration. So I rather think about cooperation, in which we can sit at the table, and then we will set what we are going to be doing, but in a equal manner, if you will. So anyway, the question is, why do we need to cooperate? And I think we need to reduce inequalities. This is a problem in Africa, and it's a problem in Latin America and many other places. We need to give more opportunities, particularly to the youth, as you're mentioning, and we need to be more inclusive. And in that sense, the framework, and we need to work on this cooperation, has to sort of fulfill these main objectives. It's not just to have exchanges of students or mobility of faculty here and there. No, you need to accomplish something. And then in that regard, there are many good examples of this cooperation that we can work on. And for example, in Europe, they have the Erasmus program, and it has worked very well with mobility of students and faculty. Why is that we don't have some sort of a program like that in the Atlantic Basin, in which we have some mobility? Not only could be physical mobility, now could be virtual mobility. We can internationalize our curriculum so that we can have a forum like these ones in a virtual manner, and we can discuss problems among, let's say, students from South Africa, from Kenya, Nigeria, and from the United States, and from Mexico, and from Morocco, of course. And then there are many ways in which we can discuss and actually develop solutions. One of the things that we need is to, for example, develop the workforce for the future. Artificial intelligence is going to move is going to disappear, if you will, some of the jobs that we have right now, jobs that the machine can do repeatedly. And that doesn't mean that those creative work jobs will disappear. But we need to train the new generations to use artificial intelligence, and then we need to reskill the workers that we have. And this is something that can be done and should be done in a cooperative manner, because lessons that are learned in Morocco could be very useful in South Africa and will be useful in the United States and Mexico and whatever. So these are the kind of things that we can work. And of course, there's plenty of things. But why don't we develop a framework? You were asking what can we do, COMEXI and the Policy Center and many others, and what we could establish a framework of this cooperation, and then design the house. Academic mobility, student mobility, workforce development, and for example, languages. We need to learn French, why not? and you need to learn Spanish and or English, and or any other language. And this will be a way to develop a more tolerant society, to have more knowledge among ourselves. And Madame Rampili was mentioning this is the cradle of civilization. Very few people know that, I'm sure, that the human species started in Africa, and we can learn from each other if we have these sort of exchanges. I think the best option that we have right now is to educate the youth, and to take the educated youth on the positive, on the future. And of course, that's what we engineers are. We can solve the problems for you.
Our work here is done. Okay, no. Mampele, I'm coming to you now because, of course, on the continent, we have the issue of youth unemployment, but also when we see the youth stepping up, and this is very true for us in Kenya, when we see the youth stepping up to take ownership of their destiny, it's us, the older generation, who come in and undermine them. And so from where you sit, given your own experience in the liberation movement in South Africa, how best do we harness the youthful energy in building communities of interest? We've got the how in terms of technical cooperation and things that we can focus on, but you have lived experience of this.
The fundamental starting point is self-liberation. My generation was the generation of the Gen Zs, you would say then, 1968. And we are the ones who liberated ourselves from the idea of being called non-European. Imagine, in Africa, you are a non-European. Crazy, isn't it? Non-white. Who said that I wanted to be known by my color? But this was an imposition, and my great-grandparents, my parents had accepted it. And we had accepted it until 1968. And then we woke up and said, as long as you judge yourself by the standards set by the person who's oppressing you, you have no chance. So self-liberation is the beginning of wisdom. Because then when you have re-embraced the essence of who you are as a human being, no one can bully you on racist, sexist, or any other. At least my personal history attests to that. I'm not very strong physically, but I don't get bullied. Not because I do anything, I just look at you and you can't bully me because I'm free. A free spirit cannot be suppressed. So my generation and your generation and the generations before this current youth are the ones who failed to lay the foundations for Africa's greatest wealth. It's young, gifted, and energetic people, not to be job seekers, but to be contributors, innovators, creators of a future that we, as their parents and grandparents, would be proud of, but importantly, that they would be more comfortable bringing up their own children. What gives me hope, and I speak here as a member of the Club of Rome, we managed to negotiate with the UN, and the UN last year in August 2023 proclaimed a decade of sciences. Now, someone here this morning was talking about science, you've got to respect science, you don't bring in. It's the silo mentality that is a problem. If you go back to ancient sciences, everything is connected to everything else. You didn't have biology, botany, zoology. You had an understanding of biological sciences and so on, but you also understood how they work with chemistry, with physics, and with cosmology, right? And so we have the good fortune now that we've got a decade, UN decade of sciences for sustainability, which is aiming at changing the epistemology that is a product of the Industrial Revolution to having a much more humanistic approach that is integrated, but that frees the talents of your greatest artists, your greatest scientists, your greatest engineers, etc. But they will be fully educated beings, not technicians, but fully educated. And I also have the great fortune of being the head of the Club of Rome's intergenerational conversations. We have young people from China, from India, from Latin America, from Africa. I'm talking now close to 2 million young people who meet virtually and are sharing. They are not waiting for the golden oldies to give them permission. They're just doing it. And so I believe, quite frankly, the greatest gift for the Atlantic communities is the youthful populations we have. Imagine what we can achieve. Just think about it. And so I'm very optimistic about the future because I know that young people are going to rise to the occasion.
Well, thank you very much. I think the PCNS would say that's why they invest in the Atlantic Dialogue's Emerging Leaders program. And so I'll open the floor to questions. And because I feel terrible for having my back to you, I'd like to start here. Are there any questions on this side? No? You're good? Okay. Nkosana, okay. Please.
I've got a simple mind, so I'm going to frame my question very simplistically. The engineer there understands the disciplines of testing a system.
Right.
You stress it to its breaking point in order to establish its limits. And I think when we're talking about us, people, we need to try to develop a similar approach.
To stress people?
When we stressed, how do we behave and how accommodating really are we of others? Because I think we can kid ourselves and use sophisticated language and what have you, but when we stressed, what do we do? Now, my simplistic architecture, I suppose, which is bothering me, for as long as the unit of account is the nation state, a country, where the accountability between the ruled and the leaders or rulers, whatever I want to call them, is that unit of account. I personally think that we ought to listen to President Trump, the incoming President Trump, quite carefully, because I think we may not like his personality, but actually there are some fundamental things that he is saying which we should listen to quite carefully without being emotional about it. The unit of account of the state forces those who are elected to account to the people who elect them. If I'm elected in Zimbabwe, I'm not expected to go and look after the interests of Zambians. I'm expected to account to my people within the nation state.
Okay.
So I want to understand, in using that stress system, what exactly we're talking about. How do we do this? How do we break out of the architecture of the nation state to account to people who are not responsible for you being a leader in your own country?
All right.
How does that work?
Okay, thank you. Please pass the microphone behind you to Nick. And do you have the microphone? Pass the microphone to the gentleman there. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. I think my question is really for Mamfela, if I may. I'm sorry I'm behind you here. I was actually with Mary Robinson and also your co-president of the Club of Rome, Sandrine, in building bridges in Geneva earlier this week. But given what we're talking about communities of interest, I'd like to put to you communities of concern across the 4 continents of the basin. I'm close to Andreas, and we were talking to Dominique about this, Dominique Strauss-Kahn, earlier as well. about how to bring together those who are not just communities of interest, but communities of concern, particularly when it comes to not just the climate change, but climate emergency, biodiversity, and so on. And after all, Brazil is going to be hosting COP29. We've just COP30 next year. We've just had COP16 in Colombia as well. So what I'm wondering is, what kind of big idea is in your mind for mobilizing? And I was with Johan Rockström when the planetary health check was announced and revealed in the New York Climate Week back in September. There's a movement where the science is relentless and the warnings are terrible. And we've seen it in southern Brazil as well in the last few weeks. And I'm just wondering what big idea you have in your mind for creating a community, not just of interest, but of anxiety and action.
Okay, thank you, Nick. So you have your hand up.
Oui.
Yes, please go ahead. Adele people, we're talking about young people, and I'm surprised that your hands are not up. But anyway, carry on.
Merci bien. Merci.
Thank you, honorable moderator. Thank you, Madam Moderator. Thank you to the panelists for your wonderful contributions. If you so allow, I would like to address my question to Madame Manfredi, who addressed the issue of humanity. Naturally, from that standpoint, I believe that our personal or diversities or our specificities could be, could converge around this notion of humanity. From that point forward, 2 or 3 ideas come to mind, which is the Senghorian thought, which speaks to our roots and the fact that we can have identities, but these identities are multiple and go from the human mobility, but also communities of nations between citizens of their origin countries, their transit countries, host countries, and vice versa. So naturally, if we're in Senegal and we go to college and go to university in France, and then we go to work in the US and then China, before returning to Senegal, you're going to tap into these countries and you're going to learn from these countries.
Question?
Oui, j'ai une question et je vais la poser.
Yes, I have a question. I'm going to ask it.
C'est de savoir.
So my question is the following: is whether science can address the concerns of material concerns on the one hand, on the other hand, our cultural specificities and our sociological realities. Thank you.
Allow us to answer these questions and we will come back to you. Okay, thank you. Mampale, I think there were several questions addressed to you and then to you, Sergio.
Yes.
So please go. Have I done something?
The nation state, was that addressed to me? Okay, to all of us, okay. The nation state is made up of people. And I don't agree with reducing everything to the electorate elects people and therefore they can only do what they were elected to do. We have seen many elected people doing exactly what they please. What matters is the quality of the citizens and therefore the quality of the democracy. We're not talking democracy as a every 2 or 3 year kind of exercise. But if we are talking about democratic governance, we also are embedding in that the essence of being human. Therefore, the person who is elected is accountable not to those who voted for him or her, but to all of the human beings where he or she acts. And I would dare say let's take Africa, there are regional and of course the continental institutions. The issue is not that there is something wrong with the nation state. The problem is the limitations of linking what is committed to at the regional, the continental, and the global level with how one acts at the national level. And this ties to the issue of the communities of interest versus communities of concern. I don't know about what you mean by concern. The fact of the matter is, human beings have been known over millennia of having a gap between what we know and what we do. Even at the level, and I'll make a confession here, as a medical student, I used to smoke. You know you shouldn't be smoking. But you smoke because, and we had all manner of excuses that we're living next to an oil refinery and therefore anyway we are going to get, it's ridiculous. It boils down to that issue of self-liberation. Because self-liberation, it means you make a decision about what kind of human being you want to be, what kind of leader you're going to be, what kind of citizen you're going to be, and what kind of professional you're going to be to make a contribution for the common good. And this is the kind of values-based leadership that should stem from K to 12, where we are educating young people to understand what it means to be human and what it means to be a citizen. And this ties to your question, I didn't get your name, about the humanity versus multiple identities. Have you been to a rose garden? Yellow, pink, they're all roses, right? The fact of one single human race doesn't mean we don't recognize the richness of diversity. And the diversity is cultural, is in terms of talents, is languages, etc. What we don't want to have is the assumption that there are certain languages and certain cultures that are superior to others. That's the problem. Because that comes from the notion of some people are superior and others are inferior, or some civilizations are superior and others are inferior. So within this family of humanity, we have to have this sense that there is no me without the we. Even if I don't know you from a bar of soap, you are a human being, and therefore I have to treat you with reverence because you are human.
Sergio.
Thank you. Related to the stress and testing and fracturing, yeah, well, that's what we do indeed in engineering. However, I think one positive or one cooperation that engineers can do related to public policy is that in many cases public policies are not designed based on the problem they want to solve. What we do as an engineer, we need to sort of conceptualize the problem. Then we propose ways to design, which is why we do the testing, in order to test whether one solution is better than the other one. And then once we have the data to support one of the other solutions, then we implement it, but then we follow up that solution to actually prove that that solution is solving the problem that we conceptualized. And I think in that sense, public policies could be developed and should be developed in that way. So you need to conceptualize what is the actual problem you want to solve, and then you identify who are your stakeholders. You bring them to the table, you listen to them in order to perfect your conceptualization. You design a solution, you implement the solution, and you may fail, of course. But they should, in order to measure it fast, then you can sort of solve back or recover the solution and change the solution, modify it in order to improve it. And I think in that sense, what you are saying is how can we become more accountable if we can show that we are following a process that actually has some rationale behind it. Of course, there is a chance that you can miss it, that you don't have enough data, and then you can fail. But I think in that way you can sort of at least evaluate the progress of these public policies. And now, related to the communities of concern, I liked better the word that you mentioned at the very end, which is communities of action, because we can be concerned, but we don't do anything. We should be concerned and do something. And for example, there is a very interesting experience on the Academy of Sciences for the Youth. Typically, the members of the Academy of Sciences in the world have either no hair or they are gray hair, or both. And the issue here is that you need to have the youth, the younger researchers, to actually implement what they are learning and implement it as soon as possible. That's what the action comes. So having these sort of groups for inviting these brilliant people could be a community of action in certain areas. And of course, you can divide it into groups. For example, housing is a problem everywhere, either because housing is becoming old or because there's scarcity of housing or what have you. Well, why don't you just bring all these young people, smart people, and think that we can build housing in a different way, that we can retrofit, that we can recycle, I don't know, housing in a different way. So I think this could be one option. And then related to the question of science, whether science can solve problems, yes, I mean, that is the purpose of science. That is the purpose of technology. And of course, astronomers will argue that, well, they are looking at the planet everywhere, I mean, very far away. Well, that's fine. But eventually, that knowledge is going to prove to be useful to humankind. And that's why science is so important, has to be improved. And I will invite the Atlantic Dialogues to have a panel in the future to talk about science and technology, not to discuss whether artificial intelligence is better because it's in this program or another program or biomaterials. No, to discuss the how science and technology can change humankind and improve the well-being of humankind.
Okay, thank you, Jennifer.
I just wanted to follow up on the question of the nation state. I really like the comment that Dr. Ramappalli had made earlier about the fact that we have to teach everyone their rights, but also their responsibilities. And I think right now we may have erred on the side of everyone knows their rights, but they sometimes don't want to live up to the obligations of being a citizen in a democracy, and how they have to understand their responsibilities, because that's the only way you're going to get transparent, accountable governance, is if people understand what they need to do to ensure that they can demand of their leaders of whatever stripe, be it local government or at the national level. And so I think that that's very important, that it is a two-sided coin. People have rights, but they also always have responsibilities, and that is what protects their rights, is their exercise of those responsibilities. And on the community of action, I also like the community of anxiety comment, because sometimes that is what we are, a community of anxiety. We're looking at issues that are causing us to be quite concerned. But again, the idea that nation states in the past, it is true, have not cooperated fully or as well as they could. I think we're at the point now where we realize, for instance, ocean currents are changing. They're not changing because any one country is doing anything, but it is going to affect all of us. And we absolutely need to stop thinking we can do it on our own, that we can do it in a way that is going to be short-sighted or is not going to actually address the multiple problems we'll see from these things. How are we going to address it? It has to be done in a cooperative fashion so that we're hearing from everyone who's affected and everyone who has an ability to, to help alleviate the problem. And I think that, I hope nation states are moving in that direction more so now. Thank you.
You got the mic, go ahead.
Yes, thank you very much. This is really wonderful discussion, and I love everything that I heard. I mean, there is no races, one human race, cooperation rather than collaboration, that we have responsibilities as well as rights. This is great, and I actually would vote for Mandela to be president of the world. But my question is that the world actually seems to be going in a totally different direction from what you are talking about. I mean, if you look at the results of the elections in the United States, if you look at what's happening in Europe, even in Africa, where we see different ethnicities fighting and all the civil wars and so on. So what can we do about it? What you have presented is such a wonderful image, and such a wonderful objective, but we're so far away from it. How can we get there?
Okay, I thought that's what they were doing, because the title of the panel is Beyond Fragmentation, the fragmentation that you've described. But people, we're racing against the clock. I would ask you to be quick in making your interventions. Please go ahead,
Yes,
sir.
no, thank you. And I will vote for you as well.
Manfella for president.
You mentioned the poly crisis, and you are absolutely right. There are so many of these, and they're interrelated. But I would guess the mother of all is the issue of youth and youth joblessness and the whole culture of youth here. And frankly, going back to what Hafez was saying, what can we do about it? Because it's good to be talking about, 10,000 feet up there. But the reality is that today in Africa, more than 30% of the youth are jobless. Mm-hmm. And we have an issue with that.
Okay, thank you. Can I get a microphone here to the young people? Just put your hands up or just stand up so the microphone can come to you. Thank you. And then go ahead.
Yeah, my comment builds directly on this, actually, and it's going to be unpopular. So I think we over-glorify youth. Look at the end of the Second World War. We had the largest generation being born, baby boomers. What do Gen Z think about baby boomers today? They think they're the people who are responsible for all of the ills in the world. We educated them. We gave them all the tools that they needed. And what happened? We screwed things up. Why? Because we're human beings. What I would say is the answer is slightly different. I would say we need to take the resource that is the youth and engage it with the other generations. The fact is you need to have more intergenerational cooperation, not just international cooperation. And that surely harkens back to pre-industrial times, not just in Africa, but around the world, when elders were respected and elders engaged with youth and passed on these messages.
But also elders had a place in society.
Well, absolutely, absolutely. And that's what I'm saying is that we forget about all too often in these discussions.
Thank you. Do you have a microphone? Go ahead.
I do indeed. I will admit I stood up absolutely ready to swing at the first half of that, but you do have a point, and it was what I was coming to. I also wanted to pick up on what Nick said about, I'm so sorry, my name is Danielle Alakija. I'm a member of the Adele 2024 cohort. And Nick mentioned something about communities of anxiety specifically. And I think that's really important because we do have a community of anxiety, and it is the youth. And we're incredibly anxious, and we're incredibly frustrated and angry because we're constantly listening to conversations about us that don't include us. And it's been a wonderful panel, and thank you all for your interventions, and you'll forgive me for saying you're talking about the youth, and you don't have any young people on stage.
That's right.
So at this point, there are 41 young leaders. I'm not going to say all here in the room because I don't want to get anyone in trouble. But there are 41 young leaders who've been here for a week coming up with some incredible, incredible insights on how to change the world and how to have a better space. I've got a very loud voice because I did theatre for lots and lots of years, so I'm used to shouting. But I think it's time to include, as you said, there needs to be an intergenerational debate. We need to rely on the expertise of our elders, absolutely, but it's the action of our youth that are going to save us at the end of the day. So my question for the panel, very quickly, I promise, is what is your practical advice for young people who may be in the room today or watching online on how to, A, start to build these communities and then start to engage with larger established organizations to affect some change?
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, so hi, my name is Asma. I'm also part of the Adele program 2024. A quick comment on youth and science, I think. So I'm working essentially in water resources management, which is an engineering field. And as a young female, the average age in the water sector, for instance, is 50 years old, and mostly are men. So I want to bring in the voice of young women to this. But also, I had a question in terms of youth collaboration or exchanges in the Atlantic dialogue. So I'm a young Moroccan. I did my education in Morocco, the UK, and China. But when I decided to go abroad, I did not look around into the southern part of the Atlantic. And I think my question is, how can we increase the investments in soft power of some of these countries to attract young people and have their education there, but also to increase the attractiveness of education institutions, because that's how you can increase like cross collaboration among countries in the Southern Atlantic region. Thank you.
Thank you. And one final question from you, sir.
William Zartman de Johns Hopkins et de Tanger. Nous avons beaucoup parlé de la collaboration.
We have spoken about cooperation quite a bit, and there seems to be complementarity in terms of contribution to value the differences that we have, and this applies to the youth as well, emphasizing these differences in order to find ways to bridge these gaps and cooperate further.
Stephanie, and then we'll work our way back to Mampele.
Thank you. I'm going to turn my back just so I can face our audience members that ask questions. I love what you were talking about. As I say, I have a 15-year-old. I'll give you a quick vignette of something that really hurt me. A friend asked me if I could talk to his daughter, who was studying in a very well-known graduate program in the United States. She was interested in working in overseas endeavors. And I talked to her and I said, well, have you taken the Foreign Service exam? That's how you become a diplomat in the United States. She said, no, because my friends told me I probably wouldn't pass it. So I said, you need to get better friends. But the first point is, do not underestimate yourself. And this gets back to Dr. Ramaphosa's point about self-liberation. Know yourself and know that you should never say no about yourself. If somebody else is going to reject you, that's okay. Never take away an opportunity yourself. And I think we have to ensure that our youth know that they should stand up for themselves at all times. And we have to empower them in that way. And I think the idea of how we help with countries to become more attractive, let's say, to having interconnections or exchanges. Brazil has some wonderful scientific universities. I was a biochemist before I became a diplomat, and in my lab, we had people from Argentina, from Chile, from Brazil, from Paraguay. We had people from all over the world, China, Finland, Japan. I think that they're out there. We just maybe need to get more information out. But I love the idea of creating more connections so that students are looking around the world to where they can go and blossom when they're in a community of others who have similar ideas. But I'm absolutely sure I'm on the other side. I'm a baby boomer too, so I'm part of the problem here. But I think we do have to do as much as possible to encourage youth and to give you those opportunities that we had in many ways. But you have many more. Speaking as a woman who entered a field where there were very few women in science and in diplomacy when I joined. It's been an uphill battle. We've made some changes. We have to do more. And so I welcome that energy to come in and say, I'm not satisfied with this. We need to push for greater change. Thank you.
Thank you. Sergio?
I totally agree that we need to foster intergenerational collaboration and cooperation and talking and just listening. And I have the privilege to be a university professor, and I have a bunch of students, undergraduate and graduate. And so I have to listen to them. I have to understand what their challenges, what are their fears. In many ways, they are personal fears. The COVID really affected them, and we haven't heard from to the students on what are their main challenges. And this is something that is not only a personal problem, is becoming an institutional problem. There are many universities who are not paying enough attention to the anxiety that has been built within the academics, the faculty, and within the students. And of course, we need to listen to them on that, and of course, on their ideas for the future. And as Stephanie was mentioning, we need to trust, and I trust my students. And let me tell you, when I was a student of engineering, about 5% of the students were female, civil engineering. Now they're about 25 to 30%, so it's a six-fold increase. Still small, if you will, but it's still for a very conservative engineering discipline like civil engineering. Probably you are. Water management means civil engineering, of course. We're very conservative, you know. And but I think we're striving for having more students. My best PhD students are women. And I'm sure that the more women we have, the better engineering will be made for the world. So we're happy to have more women. But we need to empower you. We need to give you more opportunities. But listen, don't wait for us to craft those opportunities. You need to open them. And you need to convince your professors that you have the ability, you have the competence to actually take that opportunity or craft your opportunity. And
sorry, Sergio, I'll interrupt to push back on that.
Yes.
Because I think around the world, women are pushing back and trying to take opportunities, but we have significant barriers, which include resistance. And so if you could respond to the emerging leader with what you, as a professor, with graduate students and undergraduate students, are doing to ensure that more women come into the pipeline and are not pushed out by the various obstacles that they face, whether in academia or anywhere. How does that work? Because the burden cannot solely be on women.
No. I'm not saying that. That's what I'm saying, that they need to talk to their professors, and whether these are female or not, and they need to convince them they have to have more opportunities.
And the professors remain unconvinced.
In many cases, they are not convinced, and you need to convince them. And there are many that are convinced that they will provide more opportunities for students.
And I think also the idea of mentorship and looking for others, and it doesn't have to be just women professors, for instance, but those that you see who are willing to be mentors and work with the same generation to convince, for instance, some of your professors might be more convinced by a peer talking to them about the benefits than necessarily from the student, because they're still locked in that power strata of I'm the professor and you're the student. You don't come to me with that.
And also depends on the age of professors and all that.
Yeah, thank you. Mampele, there were several questions for you, most of which seem to think that you're describing a utopia that is beyond reach in today's world.
Well, if you think so, come with me to Botswana. Botswana today has a president who's 50 years old. And where did it come from? From young people deciding that they are going to mobilize beyond the traditional party lines and just have young people forming an umbrella and saying, well, yes, you are part of the liberation, yes, you are part. But we want to go into the future, not to be prisoners of the past. I can tell you, Mozambique is in dire straits now. The adults are in dire straits. The young people are clear. The election was stolen. They are tired of liberation parties that claim to be the messiahs when in fact they are the thieves. And they are making clear that unless there is an acknowledgement that they, as a majority, voted for different parties, right? So this is not utopia. And let me say to you, my dear daughter there, who is asking why you are not on the panel, you as the cohort of young leaders who are here, you saw the program. Why didn't you challenge the people who have gotten you here, the Atlantic Dialogue, who are arranging this, to say, why are we not on the panels? And I'm speaking as someone who was smaller than you at the time when, in 1968, we didn't wait for permission. We just moved in and we didn't make noise. We just moved in and said, we've got a point of view, right? And I would also urge you to do one thing that we are proud of at the Club of Rome is we have this intergenerational conversation, not just young people are the messiahs who are going to save us, but we need to learn from one another. We made big mistakes, and you must learn from our mistakes in order to go to the next level. And I agree, it's not the duty of women to change their agenda, but it is in our interest to put an end to a patriarchal system that's robbing the world of the wonderful talents of women. And so we've got to also look at it as it's an institutional cultural problem, which is part of the imposition. Because remember, Africa didn't have a patriarchy before colonial conquest. the chiefs and the what have you that were, it was most indigenous communities were matriarchs. And the reason was that for a very long time, our ancestors didn't know where women got these children from. It was a miracle. So they thought these are gods. They must just be. So when they figured out that they had some role to play, they still treated women with reverence until the colonials came with their patriarchal systems and created what we have. But we should not be prisoners of that past. And so I believe that each one of us, young, old, in whatever institutions we are in, we have to be pushing for institutional cultural change that creates an environment for all talents to flower. Because for God's sake, I'm 77, I'm going in a different direction. I would like to see young people leading. And I did say to people earlier today that it's really a pity that we don't have the voices of young people.
Okay, so let me interrupt you because because of time. And I do want to say I've been coming to Atlantic Dialogues for a couple of years, and there's a tradition, there's a traditional space allocated to young people. And so what will happen is that the emerging leaders will be center stage tomorrow, sharing their views in the way they want for over an hour. At 16:15 tomorrow, at 4 o'clock tomorrow, there will be a panel with the veteran, distinguished broadcaster, Nick Gowing, in what we hope will be true intergenerational dialogue. So there is space for you here at AD, and that's the way it's been constructed. But typically what you also find is that some of the panelists tend to be former emerging leaders showing up. My panel is not representative necessarily of AD's design because we had some people dropping out and others stepping in at the last minute. So we give grace for last minute shifts, but also pay attention to the agenda because there is space for young leaders. Okay? Thank you. So look, this panel is standing between you and dinner. There's some yawns. I see people putting their jackets on. But I wonder if we could take a minute to allow the panelists to sum up their thoughts. And I did have a question for you. I'm not sure whether you can answer it, given that you might be starving. Can you answer the question, or should we just close and go to dinner?
Answer the question.
You want to answer the question? Mm-hmm. Okay, so my question to you guys and the audience is, given everything we've discussed today, if you take out your AD Connect, given everything we've discussed today, reflecting on the discussion, what is the most significant shift in your understanding of how Atlantic communities of interest can bridge divides and foster inclusive cooperation?
Trust.
Okay. Trust, dialogue, partnerships.
Solidarity.
I want to say thank you. Our work here is done, but not quite. And so panelists, very quickly, how do we action these, because you've done well, and this is what the audience is saying, that, you spark thinking, creative thinking, and possibilities. But how do we move towards that? If you could take 1, 2, 3 steps to actualize a more trustful partnership across the Atlantic Basin, what would it be?
Thank you. It's a tough question. I think, again, coming to any question with a degree of humility, not any one of us knows what the answers, all answers are, and understanding we are interdependent, to your point of we all came from one place, we all are here on this earth together. I think if we don't accept interdependence as a reality, then we oftentimes think we don't need the other. We don't need the other country, the other community, and I think we do really have to do that. That's not a prescription of, do this. I would say trying, as we are in our small way in this initiative that we've started, the Partnership for Atlantic Cooperation, looking at practical solutions to problems by bringing the force of expertise, resources together, and trying to solve a problem, can start building some of those communities.
Thank you, Sergio.
Well, as Stephanie said, I don't think we have all the answers, but I may just propose an experiment. Why don't we take the emerging leaders from now, let's say the ones that are here with us, and the ones that have been in the past, former. Why don't you just establish a social network for itself, and then convince them to be ambassadors in their own countries, to actually invite other sort of emerging leaders in their own countries, or the ones that actually were proposed to be emerging leaders and were not selected. And then why don't we just establish a network and put a problem every month or every week, and then try to get in sort of a crowdsourcing ideas how to solve that problem. And we'll see what happens.
Okay. And Mampele, you get the last word.
Mine is just simply, we are stronger together, and intergenerational conversations like you are describing as an experiment, we have them in the Club of Rome. We call them fireside chats.
Look, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your kind attention. Please, a round of applause for our wonderful panelists, Sergio Alcocer, Stephanie Miley, Mampele Rampele. Thank you so very much.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, under the high patronage of His Majesty King Mohammed VI, the Policy Center for the New South is organizing the 13th edition of the Atlantic Dialogues Conference, scheduled to take place from December 12th to 14th, 2024, in Rabat, Morocco. This flagship event will convene over 400 distinguished leaders from the public and private sectors, civil society, international organizations, think tanks, and the media across the Atlantic Basin, fostering open and candid discussions on pivotal cross-regional and cross-sectoral challenges. This year's conference marks a significant evolution, transitioning from annual thematic focuses to a broader, more inclusive approach emphasizing the wider Atlantic space's core values and strategic importance. The agenda will delve into critical topics such as geoeconomics, regional security, democracy,